On a night in 1968, outside an American perimeter in the jungle, a Viet Cong sapper named Kai spent 40 minutes crawling a distance of 30 meters in total darkness and total silence to move a single object about the width of a book, and by moving it, he turned the Americans' deadliest weapon into their executioner. The object was a Claymore mine. The Americans had set it out in front of their position at dusk, the way they always did. Part of the ring of firepower they placed around themselves every night. It was a curved slab of olive green plastic on the little scissor legs, packed with explosive and 700 steel balls aimed outward into the darkness. When the Americans fired it, it would sweep the ground. An attacker had to cross with a wall of steel. It was one of the most feared weapons of the entire war, and every man in that perimeter was counting on it. And it had one weakness, born of the very thing that made it so deadly. It fired in only one direction. That was its genius. All its killing power focused forward into its 60-degree arc, wasting nothing. But a weapon that fires in only one direction can be made to fire in the other direction. And the Claymore, sitting out there in the dark on its little legs, did not know which way it was facing. It fired wherever it was pointed. It had no loyalty. It would kill whoever was in front of it, and it did not care who had set it there. Kai knew this, and so, in the blackness, with the American sentries a few meters away straining to hear him, he reached out and, with infinite care, picked up the mine and turned it around so that it now faced back toward the men who owned it. Then he crawled away as silently as he had come. Kai could not know the names of the young Americans in that perimeter, sleeping and standing watch a few meters away, who now had their own weapon aimed at their hearts. He knew only that when the attack came and the Americans reached for their claymores to sweep the darkness with steel, the steel would come the other way. He had not smuggled in a weapon. He had not fired a shot. He had simply changed the direction one object faced and turned the enemy's greatest source of safety into the thing that would kill them. That is the story of the most quietly terrifying duel of the entire war, fought in total darkness and total silence, over which way a slab of plastic was pointing. Now let me show you how it worked, and why it kept an entire army awake at night. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand why a man would risk his life to move a mine a few inches, you first have to understand what the Claymore was, and why the Americans loved it, and why that love became a vulnerability the enemy learned to exploit. To understand the duel in the darkness, you first have to understand the weapon at the center of it, because everything about this story flows from one feature of its design. The Claymore mine was, in one sense, a simple thing. It was a curved rectangular case about the size of a thick book made of olive green plastic that stood up on a pair of little folding scissor legs so it could be aimed. Inside it was a layer of explosive, and packed into the face of it, in front of the explosive, were 700 small steel balls. When it detonated, the explosive drove those 700 steel balls forward, out of the front of the mine, in a spreading, sweeping pattern, a horizontal blast of shrapnel that scythed across everything in front of it, out to 50 meters and beyond. One claymore could clear a wide swath of ground of every living thing in it in an instant, and it was aimed. This is the crucial point. Unlike the mines people usually imagine, the buried kind that a man steps on, the claymore was a directional weapon. All of its power was thrown forward in a 60-degree arc into the zone the operator chose. Nothing was wasted going backward or sideways. This is what made it so devastating. Every one of those 700 steel balls went toward the enemy in a concentrated, aimed sheet of death. to make sure no soldier ever got this wrong. The designers had embossed 4 words into the front face of the mine in raised letters so they could be read even by touch in the dark. Front toward enemy, the most famous 4 words in the history of American ordnance, and the whole story of this video lives inside them. Say them slowly. Front toward enemy. On the surface, they're just an instruction, a helpful reminder so a nervous soldier does not set the mine up backward and kill himself. That is why they are there. But turn them over and they contain a confession. They admit that the mine has a wrong way round. They admit that facing it correctly is a thing a human being has to get right, by hand, in the field, often in the dark. Most weapons do not need such a warning because most weapons cannot be so completely, fatally reversed. The rifle points where you aim it, the grenade goes where you throw it, but the Claymore just sits there, facing whichever way it was last set, loyal to nothing, and those 4 raised letters are the only thing standing between it and catastrophe. The Americans put those words there to protect their own men from a mistake. The sappers read the same 4 words in the dark with their fingertips and used them for the opposite purpose, to make sure that when they turned the mine, they turned it all the way around, front toward friend. The same letters that kept an American safe told a sapper he had aimed it correctly at the American. One instruction read by 2 enemies in the dark to opposite ends. Because think about what those 4 words admit. Front toward enemy. The instruction exists because the mine has a front and a back, and it matters enormously which way it faces, and it is entirely possible to get it wrong. The very feature that made the Claymore so deadly that it fired all its power in one chosen direction was also its single great vulnerability. A weapon that fires in one direction is only useful if it is pointed the right way. Point it the wrong way, and all that concentrated killing power, all 700 steel balls, goes toward the person who said it. And the Claymore was command detonated, which matters here. It did not go off when someone stepped on it or tripped a wire. Not usually. It was connected by a long wire back to an American soldier who held a small firing device, a hand-squeezed generator the troops called the clacker. The soldier watched the ground in front of the mine, and when the enemy came into the kill zone, he squeezed the clacker, and the mine fired. This gave the Americans enormous control. They chose the exact moment, but it also meant something else, something that becomes the whole hinge of this story. The soldier firing the mine was not out at the mine. He was back at his position, holding the clacker, in the dark, often unable to see the mine itself at all. He fired it on faith. He squeezed the clacker, trusting that the mine, out there in the blackness, was still pointing the way he had left it. And that trust was exactly what the enemy learned to attack. There was another way the Americans used the Claymore, and it is worth knowing because it shows how versatile the weapon was. They did not only fire it by hand, they also rigged it to fire on its own, wired to a tripwire across a trail, so that anyone who walked into it set it off. The soldiers called these mechanical ambushes. A small unit could sow a trail or an approach with these self-firing claymores and cover far more ground than its numbers should allow, killing an enemy who wandered into the kill zone with no American even present. It was an efficient, deadly use of the weapon, and it made the Claymore a threat that could be anywhere, waiting, with no one behind it. But the command-detonated version, the one a man fired by hand with the clacker, was the heart of the perimeter defense, and it was the one the sappers learned to turn. Because the mechanical ambush fired the instant something touched the wire, but the hand-fired mine waited on a human decision, made in the dark, on trust. And trust, unlike a tripwire, is something you can poison. The sappers went after the mines that depended on a tired man's certainty because certainty was the thing they could steal. The Americans placed their claymores out in front of their positions every evening, and the enemy watched them do it. And out of that watching came one of the most audacious tactics of the war. If the mine fires whichever way it points, and the man who fires it cannot see it in the dark, then the way to defeat it is not to destroy it. It is to turn it around. The men who did this were sappers, combat engineers, and infiltration specialists, and they were among the most skilled and courageous soldiers on the entire battlefield. And it is important to say that plainly at the start, because what they did required a level of nerve that is hard to comprehend. Their job was to penetrate American positions in the dark, silently, getting close enough to do their work and getting out again, and it was some of the most dangerous work of the war. A great many of them died doing it. They crawled into the teeth of an alert, armed, frightened enemy, and they did it with patience and skill that even the Americans on the receiving end came to regard with a kind of awe. Picture what the task actually involved. At dusk, the sapper watched from concealment as the Americans set out their claymores and settled into their night positions. He marked where each mine was and which way it faced. Then he waited, often for hours, for the deep middle of the night, when the human body most wants to sleep and a tired sentry is at his weakest. And then he began to move. He prepared himself first, the way these men learned to. He stripped off anything that could rattle or catch or shine. He darkened his skin. He fixed in his mind the exact map of the ground he had studied at dusk, where the mine was, where the sentries were, where the flares and trip wires might be, and he emptied himself of hurry. That was the hardest part and the most important. A man in a hurry makes noise. A man in a hurry dies. So the sapper set aside the part of himself that wanted to be done and away, and he became, for the next hours, a creature of pure patience. He crawled. Not the quick, low crawl of the movies, a crawl so slow it was almost not movement at all. Inches at a time, feeling the ground ahead of him with his fingers for twigs that might snap, for the trip wires of flares, for anything that might betray him. He might take an hour to cross 30 meters. He controlled his breathing. He froze completely whenever a sentry stirred. He was crawling toward men who would kill him instantly if they detected him, men who were listening for exactly the sounds he was trying not to make, and he did it anyway, with a patience that is genuinely superhuman because everything depended on absolute silence. And when he reached the mine, he did his work with the same terrible care. He could not simply flip it. A sudden movement, a scrape, the click of the legs on a stone, any of it could bring the whole perimeter down on him. So he reached out in the dark and found the mine by touch and felt for the raised letters, front toward enemy, to know which way it faced, and then, with infinite slowness, he lifted it, turned it, and set it back down, now facing the Americans. Think about doing that with your hands, in the black, a few feet from a man who wants to kill you. The mine is live. The wire runs back to an American who might squeeze the clacker at any second, for any reason, and if he does while your hands are on it, you're gone. You cannot see it. You are reading it with your fingertips, feeling for those raised letters to know front from back, because getting it wrong means you did all this for nothing. You have to lift it without letting the leg scrape. You have to turn it without letting it knock against anything. You have to set it down soundlessly in soft earth in exactly the right new position. And you have to do all of it slowly because speed is noise and noise is death. There is a strange intimacy to it when you think about it. The sapper's hands, in the dark, on the enemy's weapon, inches from the enemy's sleeping men. Closer to them, in that moment, than their own comrades, handling the very thing they trusted to keep them alive and quietly betraying it. And then, the work done, he began the long, slow crawl back out, which was just as dangerous as the crawl in, because now he was tired, and the temptation to hurry, to just get away, had to be fought down with every meter. Think about the mind required to do this. To lie in the dark, a few feet from an enemy who wants you dead, and to work slowly, precisely, patiently, on a task where the smallest error means instant death. It is one of the purest tests of nerve in all of warfare, and these men passed it night after night and turned the Americans' own weapons against them. Whatever else is true about that war, the courage and skill of the men who did this was extraordinary, and any honest telling has to begin there, now cross the wire, and stand with the Americans, because to understand why this tactic was so devastating, you have to understand what it did to the men on the other end of it. And what it did was worse than kill some of them. It poisoned the thing they most relied on. The Claymore was supposed to be a source of safety. That was its whole psychological role in a night position. A unit dug in for the night in hostile country was a frightened thing, a small group of men in the dark, surrounded by jungle that might be full of enemy, unable to see, waiting. The Claymores were their answer to that fear. They ringed their position with these mines, aimed out into the darkness, and it let them believe that if the enemy came, they could sweep the approaches with steel at the squeeze of a hand. The Claymores were the perimeter's teeth. They were what let a man on watch feel that the darkness in front of him was covered, that he was not helpless. And the turning of the mines took that away and replaced it with something much worse than simple danger. Because now, when the attack came and the American squeezed his clacker, he could not be sure what would happen. Would the mine sweep the enemy, or would it sweep him? The weapon he was counting on to save his life might be the thing that ended it, and there is almost nothing more psychologically corrosive than that, to reach for your own weapon in the worst moment and not know whether it is still yours. Imagine the reality of it in the middle of a night attack. The perimeter erupts. The enemy is coming out of the darkness. The American grabs his clacker to fire the Claymore that is supposed to break the assault, and in the back of his mind is the terrible question, did someone turn it? Is it still facing out? If he fires it and it has been reversed, he will cut down himself and the men beside him with 700 steel balls. If he does not fire it, he loses his best defense at the moment he needs it most. That hesitation, that doubt, injected into the most critical seconds of a fight, was itself a kind of victory for the enemy, even on the nights when no mine had actually been turned. Hold on that half second, because it is the whole story compressed into a heartbeat. A man in a firefight, in the dark, with his enemy rushing him and his thumb on the firing device of his best weapon. Every instinct says, squeeze it, and a cold voice in the back of his skull says, are you sure? Are you sure it's still pointed the right way? He has perhaps 1 second to decide, and there is no way to check, and both choices might kill him. Fire a turned mine, and you shred yourself and your friends. Fail to fire a good one, and the enemy is on you. There is no right answer available to him in that second, because the enemy has stolen the one thing he needed, which was certainty. And most nights the mine was fine. That is the cruel arithmetic of it. Most nights no sapper had come, and the Claymore was exactly where the American had left it, pointing out, ready. But he could not know that in the moment, and so he paid the price of the doubt every single time, on every mine, whether or not anyone had touched it. The sappers had made him afraid of his own weapon, and fear does not check the facts before it strikes, because that is the truly insidious part. The sappers did not have to turn every mine, or even most of them. They just had to turn enough of them, often enough, that the Americans could never again fully trust their Claymores. Once you know that the enemy sometimes turns the mines, every mine becomes a question. Every night you have to wonder. The doubt spread far beyond the mines that were actually reversed and infected all of them. A weapon you cannot trust is worse than no weapon at all, because it consumes your attention and your nerve. And the enemy had turned the Americans' great source of comfort into a permanent source of dread. That is a remarkable thing to achieve by moving a piece of plastic a few inches in the dark. The Americans were not fools, and they did not simply accept this. They developed a whole set of countermeasures to protect their claymores, and the back and forth that followed is one of the great small cat and mouse contests of the war. A duel of adaptation fought in the dark, over and over, each side answering the other. The first and most obvious answer was to watch the mines. If the danger was that someone would sneak out and turn your claymore, then keep the claymore where you could see it and keep eyes on it. Position the mines within view of the perimeter so a sentry could watch the ground where they sat. But this ran into the hard reality of the jungle at night, which is that you often could not see anything at all. In pitch darkness and thick vegetation, a mine 30 meters out was invisible, and the sapper crawling toward it was more invisible still. Watching worked better in theory than in the black of a jungle night. So they tried to fix the mines in place. If the problem was that the mine could be turned, then make it hard to turn. Soldiers staked the legs down, they anchored them. In some cases, they weighted them or packed material around them so that a sapper could not simply lift and rotate the mine without a struggle that would make noise and take time. This helped, but it was not a complete answer either, because a patient, skilled sapper could often defeat these measures, and because anything that made the mine harder to turn also made it harder for the Americans themselves to place and adjust and recover. Then came the cleverer answers, the ones that tried to turn the tables. If the enemy is going to crawl out to your mines in the dark, then the space around your mines becomes a place the enemy will be, so cover it. Some units set out additional devices, tripwires, and warning measures around their claymores, so that a sapper trying to reach the mine might set off a flare or a warning that would expose him. Others watched their own mines as bait, waiting for the sapper. The mine was no longer just a weapon aimed outward. It became the center of a little trap, and the man crawling toward it might find that he was the one being hunted. And there was a grim daily ritual that the turning of the mines forced on the Americans, one that is rarely talked about and captures the whole nerve-wracking nature of it. The mines had to be recovered or disarmed often each morning, both to prevent civilian casualties and to reset the position. And this meant that every morning an American soldier had to crawl back out to those mines. Out to the mines that might have been turned in the night, out to the mines that might have been booby-trapped by the same sappers who turned them, wired to explode when touched, crawling out to your own claymore in the gray dawn, not knowing if the enemy had been there in the night, not knowing if it would kill you when you reached for it, was one of the quietly terrifying routine tasks of that war. The men who did it carried a specific dread that most people have never heard of. Live in that crawl for a moment, because it is the exact mirror of the sappers, and just as frightening. It is first light. A young American has to go out and recover the mines before the day begins, so he leaves the relative safety of the perimeter and starts crawling toward the claymore he set out 12 hours ago. And every foot of the way, he is thinking the same things the sapper thought, only in reverse. Was someone here in the night? Is the mine still facing out? Or did they turn it? Did they leave it alone? Or did they wire it so that when I reach out to disarm it, it kills me? He cannot know. He can only crawl toward it and find out. He reaches the mine. He looks at it. Maybe it is exactly as he left it, and he lets out a breath he did not know he was holding. Or maybe it is turned, and the sight of it facing back toward the perimeter tells him how close he and his friends came in the night, and how quietly. Or maybe it looks fine, and he reaches for it, and only then discovers the thin wire the sapper left, and the world ends. Every morning, some American somewhere made that crawl toward that object with that dread. The sappers had turned even the dawn, even the safe, quiet hour after a night survived into a thing to be feared. So the contest went back and forth. The Americans watched, staked, trapped, and checked. The sappers adapted and grew more careful and kept coming. Neither side ever fully won because the fundamental fact never changed. The Claymore pointed one way, and in the darkness, no one could be entirely sure which way that was. The duel was permanent because the vulnerability was built into the weapon itself. It would be easy to see the turning of the Claymores as a clever trick, and it was, but it was also something larger, and understanding what it really achieved tells you why it mattered so much, more than the small number of men it directly killed. Start with the fact that the enemy was not simply defeating a weapon. They were doing something more elegant. They were using the enemy's own strength against him, which is the essence of how the whole war was fought by the weaker side. The Americans had overwhelming firepower, and the Claymore was a piece of that firepower, and the sappers had found a way to make that firepower serve them instead, at no cost in material, using nothing but patience and nerve. This is the guerrilla's oldest dream: to make the enemy's strength into a weakness, to let him defeat himself with his own weapons. Turning the Claymore was that dream made real in the most literal possible way. The Americans brought the steel. The sappers simply changed which way it flew. Weigh the cost of it on each side, because the imbalance is the whole point. The Americans had spent a fortune to put that Claymore in the field. The research, the manufacture, the explosive, the E-700 machine steel balls, the shipping of it halfway around the world, the training of the man who carried it. An enormous industrial effort stood behind that one slab of plastic, and the sapper defeated all of it with resources that cost nothing at all. A few hours of patience, a steady heartbeat, and the willingness to risk his life crawling in the dark. He did not need a factory. He needed nerve. And nerve was the one thing his poor country had in abundance. That is the exchange rate the whole war ran on, made visible in a single object. The rich side spent steel and machines and money. The poor side spent courage and patience and often lives, and in the specific case of the turned Claymore, the poor side's cheap resource beat the rich side's expensive one because the vulnerability was never in the steel. It was in the darkness and the trust and the tired human mind, and those could be attacked with nothing but a brave man willing to crawl. And it fed something even more valuable to the enemy than the occasional friendly fire casualty. It fed doubt, and doubt is corrosive to an army in a way that casualties alone are not. We have seen this pattern before, and it runs through the whole war. The enemy's most powerful weapon was very often not a weapon at all. It was the ability to make the Americans distrust their own tools, their own safety, their own ground. A minefield you cannot trust, a perimeter that might have been penetrated, a weapon that might be turned. Every one of these things ate at the American soldier's peace of mind, made him more tired, more anxious, less able to rest, and a soldier who cannot rest is a soldier being slowly worn down. The sappers, by turning a few mines, made every American in that perimeter sleep worse, watch harder, and trust less. That was worth far more than the mines themselves. There is a further dimension worth being honest about, which it's that the enemy also used directional mines of their own, and used them well. They had their own version of the Claymore, a directional mine of their own manufacture, a crude but effective device that threw shrapnel in a directed blast, much like the American one, which they placed along trails and used in their own ambushes. So this was not a story of a primitive enemy marveling at a magical American weapon. It was a story of two sophisticated forces who both understood directional mines perfectly well, and one of whom found a way to weaponize a flaw in the other's use of them. The sappers understood the Claymore so completely, better in a sense, than the men who owned it, that they could turn its greatest strength into its fatal weakness. That is not the mark of a primitive enemy. It is the mark of a brilliant one. And notice, finally what the whole duel reveals about the nature of that war. It was a war fought again and again in the gap between a weapon's power and the human beings who had to use it. The Claymore was nearly perfect as a machine. Its vulnerability was not in the machine at all. It was in the darkness and the fatigue and the trust that a tired man had to place in an object he could not see. The sappers did not defeat the Claymore. They defeated the conditions under which men had to rely on it, and that is a lesson that goes far beyond one mine in one war. The strength of any weapon is limited by the frailty of the people who must wield it in the dark when they are exhausted and afraid. Kai survived the war. Many sappers did not, and in his old age he remembered those nights of crawling toward the American mines as the most concentrated fear he ever experienced, and also as the work he was proudest of. He did not remember it as clever exactly, or not only clever. He remembered it as terror mastered. To crawl for an hour toward men who would kill you the instant they heard you, to work with your hands on a live weapon a few feet from a sentry, to turn it and crawl away again, this required a control of fear that he did not know he possessed until the war demanded it. He remembered the sound of his own heartbeat, which seemed loud enough to give him away. He remembered freezing for whole minutes when an American shifted or coughed. He remembered the specific horror of the crawl back out, when everything in him screamed to move faster, and he had to force himself to keep the same agonizing pace. He had been more afraid on those crawls than at any other time in his life, and he had done the work anyway, and that was the thing he carried. And he understood, looking back, exactly why the tactic had been worth the terrible risk. It was not really about the Americans he killed with their own mines, though there were some. It was about what it did to all of them. He knew that every mine his comrades turned made every American in that war trust his Claymores a little less. He knew that the doubt spread far beyond the mines they actually reached. He had helped to poison the enemy's confidence in one of his best weapons, and he had done it with no weapon of his own, using only patience and nerve and the darkness. For a soldier from a poor army fighting a rich one, there was a deep satisfaction in that, in defeating the enemy's steel, not with more steel, but with the simple human act of turning it around. That satisfaction, Kai came to feel, was the emotional center of the whole war for men like him. They could not beat the Americans at the game the Americans were good at. They had no answer to the firepower, the aircraft, the endless supply. If the war had been only a contest of material, they would have lost it in a year. But the war was never only that. It was also a contest of will and patience and cleverness, and in that contest, the poor side could win because those things cannot be manufactured and shipped. They can only be summoned from inside a man in the dark when everything in him wants to run. Turning the Claymore was that whole idea in miniature. It said, your machines are only as strong as your nerve, and our nerve is stronger than yours. Kai knew that was not the whole truth. The Americans had plenty of nerve. He had seen it, but he also knew there was something to it, that an army which had to summon its courage from inside because it had nothing else might in the end outlast an army that had grown used to letting its machines do the frightening work. He had turned their minds to prove a point he could not have put into words at the time and only understood decades later, that in a long enough war, the side willing to crawl through the dark on its belly again and again for a small advantage is very hard to defeat. He came, too, to a strange respect for the Americans on the other side of that duel, and especially for the ones who had to crawl out to the mines in the morning. He understood, better than most, what that crawl cost them, because it was the mirror image of his own. He had crawled out in the dark to turn their mines. They had crawled out in the dawn to check them, not knowing if he had been there, not knowing if the mine would kill them when they reached it. Both of them, enemies, had made the same terrible crawl toward the same object in the same fear. He felt, remembering it, a kind of kinship with those unknown Americans, the way old soldiers sometimes do with the men who shared their specific nightmare, even from the other side. The Claymore itself, he thought, was almost beside the point in the end. It was a fine weapon, deadly and well made, and he respected it. But the real battlefield had never been the mine. It had been the darkness around it, and the minds of the men who had to trust it, and that was a battlefield where steel counted for less than nerve. He had won his share of that battle with nothing but patience and courage, turning the enemy's own power to face him, and it had been, he thought, the truest expression of the whole war he ever took part in, the weak defeating the strong, not by matching his strength, but by understanding it better than he did. Here is what the turning of the Claymores really was, and why a duel over which way a slab of plastic faced tells you more about that war than many of its great battles. The Claymore was a nearly perfect weapon, and it had exactly one weakness, and that weakness was the source of all its strength. It fired in one direction. That concentration was its genius. It threw every ounce of its power at the enemy, wasting nothing. But a weapon that points one way is a weapon that can be made to point the other way, and the enemy understood that a thing built to face outward could, with patience and nerve, be made to face in. They did not need to defeat the Claymore's power. They only needed to change its direction, and so they turned the Americans' own strength around, literally in the dark, and aimed it back at the men who had brought it. And notice what it actually took to do that. Not a better weapon, not more firepower, not technology of any kind. It took a man willing to crawl for an hour through the dark toward an enemy who would kill him, to work with his bare hands on a live mine a few feet from a sentry, and to crawl away again without a sound. The whole thing was accomplished with courage and patience and the willingness to master a fear that would break most people and nothing else. The richest army in the world brought the steel, and the poorest of its enemies simply, silently, turned it around. That is the deepest lesson of the strange, quiet duel, and it runs through the entire war. The strength of a weapon is never just in the weapon. It is in the frightened, exhausted human being who has to trust it, in the dark, at the worst moment. The Americans had the better mind. The enemy understood, better than the Americans did, that the mine was only as good as a tired sentry's certainty about which way it faced, and they spent their nerve and their lives attacking that certainty until a weapon meant to bring comfort became a source of dread. They did not outgun the Claymore. They outthought it and outcrawled it and turned its own genius against it. A man crawled 30 meters in 40 minutes in total darkness past sentries who were listening for him to move one object the width of a book. He fired no shot. He made no sound. He simply turned the enemy's deadliest weapon to face the men who owned it and crawled away. And in doing so, he made every American in that war trust his own Claymores a little less, sleep a little worse, and carry one more small dread through the dark. That is why the Viet Cong crawled into American lines to turn the Claymores around, not to steal a weapon, to turn the enemy's greatest strength, with nothing but patience and nerve, into the thing he feared most. Now you know why. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the silent duels in the dark that decided as much as any of them on both sides of the wire. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today. And if someone in your family served in Vietnam, an infantryman who set those mines, a man who crawled out to check them at dawn, anyone in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.